friends. Can you believe it is October 2020? Time flies when you are inside alone all the time. Don't you all think? I feel like I have some quick announcements. The first is that we've selected our November book for this year. I know this episode is specifically to discuss our October book, but I want you all to be in the loop about what we're reading in November so you can get your hands on a copy. We are reading The Girl with the Louding Voice by Abby Duray. And let me read you a little bit about the story. A powerful, emotional debut novel told in the unforgettable voice of a young Nigerian woman who is trapped in a life of servitude but determined to fight for her dreams and choose her own future. This book has insanely high ratings on Goodreads and everywhere else. It's recommended by tons of publications. It's on so many bestseller lists. It's supposed to be incredible. So that's what we're going to dive into for November. I'm so excited. Shout out to Megan for helping us pick. But really what we're here to talk about today is our October spooky read, Those Across the River by Christopher Buehlman. If you're not familiar with the story, let me give you a quick rundown before we go into our lengthy discussion. Emily is here with me today on the podcast. Thank you so much, Emily, for coming to chat about Those Across the River. So let me just read you the back cover copy. I have a soft cover, so it's the back cover. Haunted by memories of the Great War, failed academic Frank Nichols and his wife have arrived in the sleepy Georgia town of Whitboro, where Frank hopes to write a history of his family's old estate, the Savoyard Plantation, and the horrors that occurred there. At first, their new life seems to be everything they wanted. But under the facade of summer socials and small town charm, there is an unspoken dread that the townsfolk have lived with for generations. A presence that demands sacrifice. It comes from the shadowy woods across the river where the ruins of the Savoyard Plantation still stand, where a long, smoldering debt of blood has never been forgotten. Dun dun dun! This is our spooky read. The New York Times recently published a list of the 50th scary books set in each state, and I am pleased to report that the Georgia book was Those Across the River, which is set in Georgia. If we have any Georgia listeners, hello! I hope you're not afraid to go in the woods after this one. Without further ado, I give you Those Across the River with myself and Emily. Welcome back to Books with Brookes. This is our October book discussion. I have my friend Emily joining me via teleconference, even though we're in the same city. Emily, hello.
Hello.
How are you doing? Thanks for being here today and for reading this book.
Of course, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. We are talking about Those Across the River by Christopher Buehlman. I did look up how to say his last name and heard him say it, and he says it Buehlman. It's a spooky, kind of a horror, I guess, a horror book that we read for spooky season. Emily, do you usually read horror?
I do not at all. So this was definitely kind of like a new kind of genre for me.
Cool. Yes, I am similar. Although since we've started book club, I've read a few. I've started dabbling in Stephen King, and we read Bird Box in January or last January, and that one really, really scared me. So I am also new to the genre and a big scaredy cat. So this was a fun one to try to read.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Did you read it or did you listen to it on audiobook?
So I did listen to it, and I did not read what the book was about or anything about it prior to starting it. And I'm really glad I did it that way because it definitely, with the exception of the beginning, does not come off as a horror book. So I was certainly fooled for quite a bit of the time.
Oh, that's fun. So at what point were you like, oh, this is what we're doing?
I mean, because of the way it started and because I knew we were doing like the spooky kind of theme, I definitely had an inkling. But since it went into like, them moving down to Whitborough and them kind of like being in love and, reminiscing on things and him struggling with the dreams and stuff, I was, I wasn't really sure like where it was going to go or how it was going to turn into a horror. So I would say I was kind of like waiting for the plot twist for like a good half of the book.
Yeah. I mean, I knew a lot about this book because I
Hmm.
researched it before picking it, but also I mean, it did take a solid half of the book before like really stuff started going on.
Right.
There were a few like kind of creepy, like tense moments, like kind of weird in the first half, but yeah, it
Yeah.
was yeah, it kind of took us a while to get to like the rising action and the spooky stuff. Um so was there anything about the audiobook that we should know or talk about? How was the narration? Like was there weird sound effects?
There were no sound effects. The guy who did the narration, and I feel like I always say this when I listen, I believe, and I don't hold me to this, I haven't looked it up, but I believe he was the same narrator as this book called Grant that I read, which is like an incredibly long book. And so it took me a little while to get away from him narrating that book. So that was a little
Yeah.
bit of something I had to become used to. But I do really
Yeah.
like his voice. He is good at like accents and playing different voices. And so it's easy for me to tell like when he's playing Eudora versus when he's playing the main character and all of those things. So I really enjoyed him as the narrator and like the audio version of this in general.
That's good. Did he do a lot of accent, like Southern accents, I assume?
He did, yeah, and he definitely did voices for like the all the different like creatures or whatever. Like he definitely played them in a unique way for each of them, so I didn't really have to hear him say like and then Martin said this. Like it was pretty obvious to me.
You knew which characters. Yeah, that's
Hmm.
super important, especially if you have a lot of characters. And this book, I
Yeah.
think, did have a lot of characters, at least a lot of like peripheral ones.
Right.
So I can see, yeah, that is pretty important. I love that you brought that up because it is so jarring when you finish a book and then listen to a different book and it's the same narrator. So I know exactly what you mean. I like one of my favorite audiobook narrators is Julia Whelan or
Hmm.
Whalen. I'm not sure how you say her last name, but she did like Educated. She reads
Mm,
for the New York Times a lot. So if you ever listen to like a New York Times long form audio, it might be her. She's all over the place. But there was, I can't remember now. I listened to Educated and then I listened to another book and they were both her. And it was, yeah, it took me a solid quarter of the book to like put those other characters away, you know?
right. And it's weird how much you kind of like catalog it in your brain that that narrator is that character, because I don't really feel a strong connection with the narrator while I'm listening to a book. But I read that book, Grant, like a good 2 years ago, if not more. And for me to immediately think of him when for the first like half
Whoa.
hour of the book, it was just really weird, like that I became that attached to a book that I like, read a long time ago.
Yeah, seriously. Do you know how long the audiobook was? This is a pretty long book.
It was 8.5 hours, which is actually pretty short for an audiobook, or for at least
Yeah.
for the audiobooks that I typically read.
I just finished Doctor Sleep, which I
Mm.
was like, I probably shouldn't listen to this at the same time that I read Goes Across the River. Like, am I going to get them confused? So it's possible that I do that. But it
Got
was
it.
like 17 hours. It was so long
Wow.
on audiobook. I know. But it was kind of great because you really like, that gives you time to really like get into it, you know?
That's true. For this one, it only took me a couple or a few days to get through. And so it's kind of one of those ones that we'll talk about it. I'll think about it for a little bit, but it'll be kind of on to the next one because it only took up like so much of my time.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's interesting. So, the ultimate question that I always ask right at the beginning and put people on the spot for, did you like the book?
I did like the book. I didn't love it, but I did really like it. Like I said, it was it excuse me, horror is generally out of my kind of genre wheelhouse, and so it was I that's what I love about book club, is that, you know, I will read all the way through books that I wouldn't typically either pick up or finish all the way. So I did really enjoy it, partially because it was different, but also like that first half where there wasn't a lot of spookiness involved. I kind of dug the Frank Eudora story. Like, I became kind of attached to, you know, what had happened before, and like where their life was going together, and all the kind of drama that came along with it. So yeah, it was
Mm-hmm.
kind of like a good combo for me.
Yeah. That's a good point. And I think actually one of our members, Megan, pointed this out at our last meeting. She was like, you keep picking like Southern books. I was like, oh crap, like I guess I do. And this one definitely was like, it was like the setting was its own character. It was like this moody, hot, like Southern town. Like, I don't know. I liked it too. I liked the first half, and I thought that the writing was excellent. And
Hmm.
I didn't think it was like super scary,
Yeah.
which was shocking to me because I thought I was going to be so scared. And I did feel like I wanted to put it down a few times, and I did put it down a few times. And there were obviously some like really heavy scenes, and any of the scenes where they like went into the woods, I
Yeah.
found to be really suspenseful, and like sometimes I needed to like take a little break. But I wasn't like scared. Like I didn't have trouble reading it at night. I don't know. Like when I read
I'm
Bird
with you.
Box,
Yeah.
I really couldn't read it at night. I couldn't read it alone in the apartment. Like I couldn't. It really scared
Or like
me.
certain scary shows I can't either, but with this
Yeah.
I was like alone in my apartment at night listening to it, and then I like would go to sleep without a problem. So I agree with you, it wasn't like terrifyingly scary, and it also wasn't like scary in a way that I am afraid of things like happening to me kind of thing.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
I think that helped.
Yeah. I think that's true. Which I think in general with like ghost or like supernatural, like I
Right.
think realistic stuff scares me a lot more than like supernatural because I don't
Same.
believe in it. Like I don't really believe in ghosts and stuff, so they don't tend to scare me. I know that's not true
Yep.
for everyone. Personal preference. Um
Yeah,
but
I'm with
yeah, it
you.
was definitely like tense. It was definitely um like kind of fucked up, excuse my language, but like some really like gross creepy things happened.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of like the school scene specifically. uh so that part I think was fun because I again like I mean I guess that's not true though. I love to read like murder mystery books and like listen to murder podcasts, so I guess I'm not new to like the subject of like
Well, I do
creepy.
too. So it's more, I think you, for me, it's like the difference between ghosts and supernatural versus like psychological thriller or murder mystery. Like the latter, I'm definitely addicted to, and I like watch those things on TV and I listen to them on the radio and all of that stuff. And that's when I lose sleep, but I also like can't stop watching.
Yeah.
But like the horror, like
Yes.
Stephen King type stuff, I mean, I'll watch the movie like whatever, but I don't really seek it out like I do with the kind of like the murder mystery type stuff. So I think
Yeah.
that like kind of fantasy scary world is like what is really new for me, like werewolves and supernatural. It's a lot. It honestly, it kind of took me a while to like wrap my head around what was happening,
Yeah.
because I was like, are they people? Are they alive? Are they ghosts? Are they mortal? Like what is this? And so it definitely
Hmm.
took me a little while to be like, okay, got it.
Yeah. I think that's how it was written though, because I feel the same way. I just thought they were like kind of feral people
Hmm.
for most of the book until it was like, oh, okay. Um, like I see what's happening.
Right.
And I'm always on the fence with these podcasts about if we should have spoilers. I think we should just have them because who's going to listen to this if they haven't read the book? If you haven't read the book, go read it. We're going to
Okay.
spoil it for you. Um, what are the major themes of this book?
So I'm struggling to really know the answer to that. Like, I've been thinking about it a lot, and it's like, it seemed like the book, all because there were a lot of like, it was the South, it was early in the 20th century, like there's a lot of racism, and obviously the whole underlying thing here is that it was his grandfather's plantation, and like there was, he
Yeah.
wanted to write a book about it. So obviously we knew for a while that slaves lived on his grandfather's plantation, and that did not end very well. So like there was always that kind of like hint that something of some sort of like a downfall or something was going to happen involving that. But I don't really like the theme or the message that the book was trying to get across or like accomplish by having that be such a part of the plot. Like I don't really know how I would answer that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I haven't been thinking about it a lot, and I should have been, clearly. But I feel like, yeah, it was kind of, yeah, like what was the point of view of this book? Um, because it doesn't have a happy ending.
Mm-mm.
It doesn't, like, our main character is kind of the hero, but he's also like maybe an anti-hero. Like
Yeah.
his choices are questionable. Um, and like nobody rides off into the sunset.
Right,
So,
is
I
like, is
mean,
revenge the theme? Like, is that what, or like, so like, is this, are the slaves getting revenge on Frank? Is that good enough for them to like get them what they wanted? And is that the theme, or is that a message? Or is, since Frank and Eudora had an affair, like, and they don't end up together or happy, is that the message? Like, you shouldn't do things like that, if that makes sense. Like,
ooh, yeah,
all
yeah,
of those
yeah.
things like crossed my mind. And I mean, it was written only so long ago, so it's like, are they really driving home the fact that like an affair can like, make you doomed for happiness or whatever in life? Like, I don't really believe that, but that was one thing that came to
Mm,
mind.
yeah, that's interesting. Because I did like, I liked their backstory. I thought it was really
Yeah,
like interesting and different and like more unusual than like a typical like love story background.
sure.
Um, because of that affair. I didn't think about it that way, but like, yeah, is this a morality lesson? Like, is this happened to them because they did this bad thing? I mean,
Right.
maybe. I also thought there was some interesting themes of like community, um, because they move, they're this young couple and they move from Chicago, this big city, they move from Chicago and they go to this tiny town, and they really like make an effort to like join the town and like become a part of its fabric. They hang out a shocking amount. Maybe this is just my COVID brain, but they spend a shocking amount of time just like in the town square and like at the hardware store and like just sitting around talking to people. And there are a few scenes where they actively discuss like wanting to participate in the town and like become a part of the town. So
Yep.
I'm like, his community could be a theme, but then at the end, they're completely rejected by that community. So
Right.
what's the lesson? Like what, yeah, so what's the point of view? I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of ties back into the whole like, sell the house, don't stay here, like you'll regret it message that the aunt sent.
Hmm.
Was it the aunt? Is that right?
Yeah, I think it was
Okay.
a great aunt,
Great
maybe.
aunt. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, they were basically driven out of town anyway, and it's like, okay, listen to your elders, like that type of thing. um
Hmm.
I don't
Ooh, what
know.
about like legacy?
Mm-hmm.
Like, should you pay for the sins of your fathers? Kind of a thing. Like,
Sure.
obviously the like people in the woods thought so. I don't think that our like main characters thought so. Um, but yeah, is there, I mean, there was an, I kind of liked, there was an interesting like I guess it would be a moral question also of like, should he write a book about his grandfather who was like this awful man?
Right.
He was like an objectively horrible person. Like, should a book be written about that person? And they had some debates about it. I can see both sides. I think we talk about this a lot nowadays, especially in terms of like racial injustices and like, should we have statues of Confederate soldiers, that kind of thing. Like,
Yeah.
you know, I'm sure the argument can be made that there's a difference between like creating a monument to someone and documenting history.
Yeah, exactly.
But like, does that history still even like need to be documented? And it's funny because throughout the book he had been like, I'm writing a story about my grandfather, but then once he gets held captive and they ask him what his book is about, he says, it's about you, it's about the slaves. And he totally flips it. And I was like, okay, well, you should have just made that argument this whole time. Like, write the story about the slaves.
You know what, Brooks? I didn't even pick up on that. That's really interesting that like it's like going to your boss and saying like, you know, this is really important to me. I want this, I want this, I want this, and I have this idea or whatever, and then like you go to your colleague and you're like, "No, like I was telling them it was your idea. Like I promise. I was telling them it was your idea." Like it's kind of like a cop out.
Yeah, definitely. And it was the first time he had described his book that way. So I did think like, oh man, this is some like white people privilege shit right here, because this guy's like wants to write about his grandfather. He feels this like connection to his grandfather, which is normal, fine.
Mhm.
But it was never his plan to make it about the slaves. It was, I don't know. Which I feel like that changes the whole book. Like, okay, yeah, we'll write a story about these people who like deserve to have their stories told, who aren't going to ever have their stories told, as opposed to write it about this like powerful guy that was famous and like had a bunch of money and like held down everyone around him. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you brought up like the privilege thing, and there were a lot of I mean, they were saying the N-word and all of that stuff, which was
Yeah, a
definitely,
lot.
I think, it kind of like to your point about the statues, like, I think that's a controversial point. And I did hear in your last podcast, you kind of pondered over the same thing, which was like,
Yeah.
it was written in 2011. Yes, that's historically accurate, but like, does that warrant a need for the N-word being used repeatedly? And it's not like they used it every other word. I think it was probably used like fewer than 10 times. But I don't really know. Like I personally think it could have been written without that, what I don't know, I guess my point here is like what what is the goal with the use of the N-word and like the underlying racism that was like pretty, I mean, it was obvious to the reader, of course, but it wasn't like it wasn't called out specifically, like you had to read between the lines. But like what was the point of it, I guess, because it felt like it was just part of the story, but it wasn't really used for any like educational purposes or like making a point or anything like that.
Yeah. I mean, I had the same questions. It was interesting. I talked with my friend John who recommended this book, and I brought that up and he was like, "Oh man, like it's so interesting." You know, he hadn't read the book in a few years. He's like, "I bet if I read it now in like 2020, I would have a
Mhm.
way different outlook on like the treatment of racial language in the story." And yeah, it was interesting. And I don't know. I mean, and again, we're like two white people talking about this,
Exactly.
which we should put out there, but it definitely did make me uncomfortable at times. The author of this book is white, which we should
Mhm.
mention.
Yeah.
It was written in 2011, which is not that long ago, but is sort of a really long time ago. When
Sure,
you think
like
it's
in
like the
the
pace things
climate of
move
things
now.
today, for sure.
Yes, exactly. So it's possible, you know, but I mean, this is something we talked about with Stephen King and with a couple of other our like more historical fiction
Mhm.
novels. Like there is a ton of like racist and sexist language in those books, and it sort of feels like part of the genre to me.
Yeah.
Um, And I don't know why that's necessary.
I agree.
Even in Doctor Sleep, which I just finished, he uses the word, which he just wrote. Like it came out, Doctor Sleep came out like last fall or something.
Okay.
He uses the word bitch like so much. And it really was like nails on a chalkboard to me. That bitch girl was a line he used over and over and over again. And I just felt like it icked me out for some reason. I had
I
just like this
am
overly
with you. I
gendered
mean, I
language.
haven't read that. Yeah, exactly. And I guess like I guess I obviously as a white person there's never like the time to use the N word, of course, but like in like a movie or in something that's like is historical fiction the right place to be using that regularly? I don't know, but like there it feels like if he was going to if he felt the need to use that sort of language, it should have been there should have been more of a reason for it. I felt like it was a little bit extra because there was a lot the whole storyline and the plot twist is all based on racism and slavery and all of the horrible things that his grandfather did. And so not really like using those really horrible things like for the benefit of the book or of the plot or for the reader or whatever, it just felt a little bit empty to me. And so I think that's something that like it felt like he was reaching for something and going somewhere with it and then it never really panned out. And so from like a quality perspective, I think that like irritated me a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. I was pretty worried in the beginning because, like we've said, it took a while to really figure out what was happening in the woods and who those people were.
Right.
And for the first, like, maybe half the book, I was like, oh no, like, are these just evil black people, like magic black people who live in the woods and like are evil? So it was kind of a relief to me when we found out that there were also white people out there. And I was like,
Mhm.
okay. Because I was afraid it was going to be this like extremely heavy like metaphor for like dangerous black people,
Oh,
which
I
is
thought
not
the same
something
thing.
you
I
want
was
to repeat.
so annoyed by that. And like
Yeah.
even when the he was like raping Eudora or like, the theory of like him raping a white woman, I was like, "Really? Like we need to perpetuate all of this? Like this is such a bad look." And that really frustrated me. And then same thing like it came out that they weren't all black people, but it felt a little bit like ooh, this is yucky. Like, why is this written 9 years ago and you're still allowing these things to just like be the narrative? Like, this is how things are, or like, like we have to
Yeah.
divide and segregate. Like, that really like threw me off, but it did end up being different than that. So,
Yeah, it did. But does it, I mean, I don't know, because we still spent half the book thinking that. I would really
right.
like to take a class. I should look for one, like an online class on this topic of like racial language, like historically accurate racial language and its
Mhm.
use in films and books and TV. Like, because it is I can see the argument of like, no, this is how people would have spoken back then. That's why it's written this way. But also, it's so uncomfortable, especially if you're a white writer. Like, I don't know. It would be really interesting to hear like other authors and like experts on this topic talk about it in more depth. I'm gonna look for that because that would
Yeah,
be
that's a
really.
great idea. And that would be
I would
something
love to
good
hear more.
for like a few for like maybe the book club to take too. So I'm definitely interested. And then
Yeah.
kind of on that topic you were saying about the other book you just finished, which is more the sexist language as opposed to the racist language. But um I
Although there
did
was
read
that too.
yes, yeah. So I did read an article about this book, and I mean I'd certainly noticed like Eudora's role was very like even though she worked and all that, she was kind of like a sex object and
Yeah.
like she made the food and that kind of thing. So while she, they said she had a job and she was a great teacher and like those things were definitely made clear, I do think that she was really like like objectified in a few different instances, and like that was really the only thing that showed through for her character for me as a reader. But then I
Yeah.
also like read an article that basically agreed with that and like felt that it was extremely sexist to just make her like basically responsible for like having people over for lemonade and making dinner and like having sex with him whenever he wanted.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And it was not really a fair, yeah, it was she was not a fully like developed character because she did work and she did have this interesting backstory and she did like make choices for herself that were like unusual for the time, probably. So she certainly wasn't like a meek housewife
Right.
like who was just there as a sex doll. Like she definitely was smart and capable and like accomplished, and all of that stuff was like irrelevant. All that mattered was
Yeah.
that she had two different colored eyes and really long legs. That was it.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was annoyed by their relationship a lot of times because I just felt like it was so blissful and euphoric, and I just didn't I was annoyed by them. Like actually there was a little bit of like Schadenfreude for me of like when things started to fall apart. I was like, "Oh, good. Thank God, because these people are too happy."
Sure, sure, sure. And um like the roles aside, like they were just like uh he's like, I am just so in love with her, like like 3 times in the book, and it's like, really, everything is just perfect.
Yeah, I know. Like, yeah, I just really love her. But they had like never gotten married, which I thought was weird for the times. They'd been together for, it felt like they were like really in the honeymoon phase of their relationship, and like maybe they should only have been together for like a year. But he had them being together for like 4 or 5 years already, and I was like, that seems like too long to
So I did
still be
think
having sex
her
like
divorce
multiple times a
hadn't gone
day.
through yet.
Oh, you cut out for a second.
Oh,
Repeat what
sorry.
you
I
said.
did read that her divorce hadn't gone through yet, so that's the only reason they weren't married, and that
Oh.
they were only truly alone, like beginning when they moved to Whitbrow.
Got it. Okay. So that does make a difference, I guess. Yeah. Okay.
Because I thought the exact same thing.
Yeah. She was just jumping his bones constantly.
Yeah. And on the other
Um,
end of that, I was like, okay, if I don't think of her as like this objectified female character, I'm like, hey, maybe she's just like really sexually awakened for the times and she's just like knows what she wants and goes after it. And that was one side of it where I was like, okay, I could get on board with that. But then she kept like making the meals and doing all that stuff. And it felt like more traditional gender roles.
yeah, well, especially that was bullshit because this fucking guy is not even working. Frank didn't
Right.
have a job, was doing nothing. Like, Frank, go cook something, like make some potatoes. You
Right.
know,
Go buy
like
the
this chick
bacon.
is teaching the entire town, like she's keeping you afloat, like yeah, bake some bread.
Yeah.
Is there a truck backing up where you are?
It sounded like that, yes, but I think it's gone.
It did. That's really funny. Okay, so I have a yes or no for you,
Okay.
which we alluded to this earlier, but like if you got a letter like this from your great aunt, and I'm looking at the letter on page 29, and there's a sentence that says, "This place will smell out. I fear what is in you and claim you for its own. It will hug your bones into the woods, and you will wish you had never." And it kind of cuts off in the middle of that sentence. So this really weird letter from her great aunt, but then it's prefaced with this like extremely brief note from the solicitor that says, "Dear Mr. Nichols, please remember that at the conclusion of her days, your aunt, who insisted I should send her letter without the benefit of revision, was heavily dependent on opiates." So I guess my question is, knowing all of that information, would you have listened to the great aunt, or would you have been like, "Oh my god, a free house, I'm moving in"?
Right? I know. I thought about this a little bit, and if I were in their situation, like where they just kind of got shunned from Chicago and like did really have to leave, I can imagine that the combination of the need for me to leave and the free house and like curiosity being piqued, I think I would probably do it. Move to the house.
Yeah, I kind of think so too, which is so funny. I mean, I don't have a great desire to go live in a small town, but COVID has changed my overall outlook on the city.
Yes.
So if I got like a random letter from a great aunt that was like, hey, check out this huge house I left for you. Oh, it's paid for. I would definitely think about going there, at least temporarily.
At least
Um,
temporarily, and like almost getting to know the town. And then you kind of are like, well, if I don't have anyone in Chicago, like maybe I would want to make a, like you said, community before, like a community here for myself kind of thing.
yeah, well, especially because, they were sort of like, at least he was like really shunned and like couldn't work in Chicago anymore and like
Yeah.
didn't like really lost his whole community. So yeah, it seemed like he was looking to replace that when he got down there, which I actually appreciated because I feel like if it were me, might be more inclined to be like really judgmental and like not want to participate in the weird like town traditions and like
Sure.
look down upon them. But I felt like they weren't really that way. At least Frank wasn't. Frank seemed like pretty down to like do all of the like towny activities and really break bread with their new neighbors.
For sure.
So I liked that about him, and definitely thought it was probably not how I would have acted. So good job, Frank.
Would you have
Um,
moved into the house?
yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I definitely think I would have looked at this creepy letter and been like, "Well, she was off her rocker." Like,
Hmm.
oh well.
The opiates give me an out. I'm moving in.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I think I would probably have dismissed that as inane, like crazy lady talk. Um, Okay, here's a question. What do you think was the significance of the highly, highly detailed dreams and nightmares that we saw from Frank? He was like, every time he went to sleep, he had a nightmare about the war,
Right.
basically.
So it's a great question. And it's kind of like, what were all of those like really key things trying to symbolize? Like the racism, and then the dreams are another one, right? Like they were very prevalent throughout the course of the book. We know that he was in the war and is struggling from PTSD, and like, his friend dying and all of those different things. But like, what do those things provide for me in the book? And maybe it's like the fact that we know that he's not some like guy who's had it really easy and just like moved down to Whitbro and like is experiencing the first traumas of his life. Like he has already experienced traumas in his life.
Yeah.
So maybe it's like meant to really portray like how strong he is and able to like go through these difficult things, or to portray how difficult and crazy this like town and across the river really is because of how like well he handled it and like still persevered and like came through or whatever. That's the only thing I can really imagine. I didn't really connect him being able, or him having severe PTSD, to anything else in the book other than the trauma that he experienced across the river.
Yeah. Yeah, I felt like it was more of like a like scene setting, like suspense building device than necessarily being like relevant to the current plot of the book. Like I think it was more because like the first half of the book basically nothing happens. So it's like, okay, and this is a like very common both literary and film device where it's like, all right, we need something scary, but nothing scary is happening. Let's have them dream about something scary. you know?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like we can just make like now the whole book is scary and suspenseful, even though the like actual scary stuff doesn't happen until page, 180 or whatever.
Right.
Yeah. But I did find some of those scenes to be like particularly heartbreaking. They
Yeah.
were they were really sad. Like he lost his best friend in the war, and like I mean he was a remarkably like well-adjusted person considering what he had been through, which I think is probably true of like tons of men of that time. Um,
Sure.
so that felt interesting to me, especially because I mean he was in this book is so old, like set so long ago. It was World War One, but
Right.
our grandparents fought in World War II, which was a similar experience. And then they went on to like just be normal people leading normal lives in small towns. Like, it's pretty remarkable to think that they did that just 2 generations ago.
Yeah, it is.
What was the scariest part of the book for you?
I think the Eudora stuff at the end was like really dark for me, just because I had kind of, you know, gender roles and all of that aside, I had kind of become like into their love story and like hoping that it would work out for them. And so it all really crashed and burned in an ugly and dark way. So like in that hotel room, and just like her knowing that she had, you know, become one of them, was really like scary and sad and dark all at the same time for me. I think that was the scariest part. And I mean, it was very vivid, like what he was describing to be taking place. Like I can't remember exactly what it was, but like, was there like some throwing up involved? It was just like a little bit extreme. And that like threw me over the edge a little bit.
Yeah. I think for me it was the second time he went in the woods, and he stayed just like a little too long. So he went to, what's his name, Buehlman, to his like house, and he's like, "You got to get out of here, take this bike, ride like hell." And I think it was really suspenseful, and I was just certain that something bad was going to happen. Like, I didn't think he was going to get home, like without some kind of altercation. I don't remember where that was, but that I think was my like, where I was like, oh, I was like getting like scared for the first time. And like nothing really happened. So I don't know, maybe for me, like suspense is scarier than like actual like gory horror.
Got it.
Like just not knowing what's around the bend is the
right. Like when your
part.
heart is racing a bit more.
Yeah, I think so. Which maybe that's why Bird Box scared me so much, because that was kind of the whole premise of it, was that like you didn't know what was going on, basically.
Yeah.
And that was really scary. Okay, well, we're pretty much at time. This has been such a wonderful conversation. You have so many smart insights and like things that I didn't think about. So I love that you brought that and we got to discuss. Is there anything you wanted to touch on that I didn't ask about?
No, I don't think so. That was great.
Cool. Well, I'm glad that you liked the book. I also liked it. Didn't love it. And I wanted to say one other thing, was that I thought that there was a fair amount of humor in this book. There were some like pretty funny lines and like some kind of funny characters. And I liked that. And it gave the book, I think, like more personality and was like more enjoyable to read for me.
Yes.
So I liked that about the writing.
I always like that too, when like amidst a kind of like darker or like sad type book, you kind of like, I was like cleaning the house when I was listening to it, and I would find myself kind of like giggling here and there, which I always find to be like a satisfying feeling when I'm reading like something that's meant to be darker.
Yes, I agree with you. You need some levity. You're such a treasure. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you, Brooks. It was great chatting, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Books with Brooks is in the Press Play Podcast Network, and our theme music is by Jonathan Allen.